Okay, so I've got a magazine here. This particular copy is a few years old, but it's still relevant to what I want to talk about. I'll just show you the magazine. Rather than just name it, I'll actually show you this. The New African. Can you see that? Picture there of Ban Ki-moon. This particular copy is from August, September 2011, so a few years ago now, but I've looked at it in W.H. Smith's, and sort of the editorial tone hasn't changed. Basically, this magazine is a Pan-Africanist, takes a Pan-Africanist outlook, and it's very, very cynical and critical of developed Western countries, notably Europe and the United States. There's a few things I'd like to talk about this magazine, but about also wider issues of governance in Africa, post-colonial Africa, I might add. It seems to me that whenever Africa has problems, it's almost always a reactionary response of blame. I was going to say the West, but West is a slightly misleading term. Let's say blame developed nations. Now, I'm not ignorant. It is absolutely true that for a very long time, for centuries, European powers like Portugal, like the Netherlands, like Britain, for that matter, like France, colonized Africa. And it's true that that is not something that could just change overnight. The legacy of that I'm talking about. It will forever be part of African history, that colonization era. But sooner or later, I would like to see African governments start to take responsibility for their own shit. And sorry for the language, but it does frustrate me when it's always a case of blame Europe, blame America for every single problem that Africa faces. You know, the decolonization process sort of began, let's say, the 50s and culminated in about the early 80s. So, in many cases, these countries have been independent for decades. Yet still, when problems occur, it's a case of blame Europe, blame America. Now, the inequality between some African states and, for example, some European countries is vast. That's true. And I always say that, of course, we do have some responsibility. We've responsibility because of our history, but also moral responsibility as rich, powerful countries to play our role in making a better world. And the United States, for example, in terms of its contributions to carbon emissions, its role in human-induced climate change, and yes, I do believe in that, is very significant. But blaming all of Africa's problems on developed countries is just a cop-out. It's taking away responsibility from governments. Now, in many cases, when you have dictators who have immense wealth, it just seems perverse that they then turn around and try to play the victim card. A good example is Mugabe in Zimbabwe, when he lavished himself on his 90th birthday. Robert Mugabe is a man who has lived almost twice as long as the life expectancy of his countrymen. Now, arguably, the situation in many African countries has got worse in the post-colonial era. And before you jump on and say, oh, I'm pro-colonialism, absolutely not, but I'm just stating a fact. That is a fact. In many countries, the situation has got worse in the post-colonial era. Now, I've just watched a documentary on Liberia, which is an interesting case because it's a country that was founded by ex-slaves. That's a country that, it's the world's fourth poorest country. It's dirt poor. It suffers widespread sexual violence, very high unemployment, endemic drug use. It's still coping with the legacy of a very brutal civil war. Really, two civil wars, but unfortunately that's a sort of poster for what a lot of African countries face. I do think it's important to show the whole picture about Africa, because there are some African success stories. We can't just talk about Africa as all being negative. There are some success stories, like Botswana, for example. Nowhere in Africa could be called wealthy per se, but it's not all bad, and I think it is damaging to always present it as bad. But likewise, magazines like this, New African, that continuously blames Europe, and incidentally, I would say they're hypocritical because they're based in London. Now, many African countries, freedom of the press is not exactly ideal. So I do think they're being pretty hypocritical, mouthing off the xenophobic anti-Western rhetoric, and that's what it is. They're stirring up hatred and hostility towards Britain, and yet they're published from Britain. Now, to me, that seems hypocritical. Why aren't they published in Nairobi, or Dar es Salaam, or Johannesburg, or Dakar? You know, to me it just seems very hypocritical that they are enjoying the freedom of expression that comes in this country, and Britain, whilst not perfect, we do generally have quite a good record on freedom of expression, and they're using that to attack us. Now, imagine if the situation was reversed, and a Western media outlook, a media network or magazine or whatever, was to voice a very critical commentary about, say, the regime of Robert Mugabe. They would be kicked out of the country. Now, to me, this therefore makes their editorial position very hypocritical, because they're blaming all of Africa's problems on the West, without taking any, and the West in this context, okay, I'm talking about Europe and America, but they're not taking any responsibility at all, and saying, actually, the likes of Mugabe do have responsibility, and he alone has that responsibility. Mugabe is president of Zimbabwe. He's not a child. He is president. He is entirely responsible for the shit that Zimbabwe faces right now. And for, you know, when people make excuses for him, like, oh, he was a great, you know, there's this sort of personality cult around Mugabe, that he's sort of this great Pan-Africanist, and he's a hero of liberation. Granted, I recognise the role he played in the Pan-Africanist movement, but the simple reality is, under Mugabe, Zimbabwe is a failed state. Far worse than what it was in the colonial era. In the colonial era, it was the breadbasket of Africa. Now it's a failed state, with massive inflation, with severe human rights abuses, and an absolutely insane nutjob of a president, who lavishes himself, fosters a personality cult, ruthlessly crushes opposition, and then has the audacity to blame it on everyone but himself. And to me, this is the attitude in a lot of African states. Now, before I'm accused of being racist, I acknowledge this is not the situation in every single form of government in Africa. It's widespread, but it is widespread. There is some good initiatives for which the UN deserves some credit, especially under the tenure of Kofi Annan. And one of his final things that he said as Secretary General was that Africa has to take responsibility for some of its own problems. Now, he's an African, he's a Ghanaian. I have a lot of respect for Kofi Annan. I think he's a very capable statesman. And I have some respect for other African leaders like Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. I think she's tried her level best in very trying circumstances. Mandela, well, I made a video about Mandela. That's sort of there's no introduction needed for Nelson Mandela. He deserves enormous respect for the work he'd done in reconciliation. Compare the legacy of Mandela to the legacy of Mugabe, and I think there's a stark difference. But it just bothers me that magazines like this promote a sort of anti-Western, anti-European, the same old broken record things like, oh, let's blame them for everything. And what's happening now in Africa is China is sort of moving in, and the Chinese sort of go on, well, we never colonized Africa, therefore we have moral high ground. But that's questionable. I think if you scrutinize what China really wants from Africa, it's entirely selfish. Of course it is. Yes, it's true that the Chinese have probably funded a lot of healthcare and social programs, but China is not a country that takes a benevolent approach to world affairs. I really don't believe that. And the idea that they haven't colonized Africa doesn't mean that their position in Africa should be above criticism. I also take issue with the fact that they talk about China's peaceful rise, but they're actually openly promoting this anti-Western rhetoric and anti-Western sentiments. You know, Africa, is a continent with massive potential. But it's about time Africans start realizing that blaming everyone but their own leadership is, and I talk about layer, I should be careful in saying that because Africa's got 1 billion people. Not all Africans think alike, so I should be very careful here about how I word this. The problem is it's so difficult to get this message out because you're instantly labelled, oh, you're a white guy, what do you know about Africa's problems? Correct. I've not been to Africa. All my knowledge is based on what I see in documentaries and media, some of it positive, some of it negative, but what I do see is a lot of this is scapegoating the West. It's scapegoating developing countries. I believe developing countries have a part to play, but I do take issue with the fact that so much of this is about putting responsibility on everyone except African leaders. Now this is a post-colonial era. African countries have had independence for years, and responsibility comes with that. Now you can say that there's exploitation of African countries still going on. That's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. You have situations where, for example, there's a demand of ivory, by the way, in countries like China and Vietnam, so that bit pretty much counters the argument that China isn't exploiting Africa. It is certainly exploiting its natural heritage, and the Chinese government only now is really starting to take that seriously. There's a massive consumer demand for ivory products in countries like Vietnam and China. So that just counters the view that Africa's entirely squeaky clean and all of it. Sorry, China's entirely squeaky clean. But another point I would make is that you know, it's true there is exploitation that goes on, and it's true a lot of that exploitation is because of demand in wealthy countries. That's true. And I've always argued that companies in Europe and North America need to do much more to put pressure on where their resources are coming from. There's very serious problems, for example, concerning child minors in countries like the DRC. I'm under no illusions about this. But so much of Africa's problems lies, for example, in tribal tensions, and there's denials about this. There's simply denials. Yet you'd have to be pretty stupid to see that that isn't part of the situation, and that is entirely African responsibility. You know, it's just trying to put this all on the West is just, I think, taking responsibility away from African leadership. And Africa is never ever going to develop as a continent until it starts taking responsibility for its own problems. And I'm not generalizing. I believe there are some good African leaders who, and certainly in smaller divisions like cities and individual states, who probably do recognize this problem. But the way I see it, there's still a lot of victimhood mentality in Africa, which on some level is understandable because Africa has arguably suffered more than any other continent. It still remains by far the poorest continent, but I'm just sick and tired of it always being a case of, oh well, there's a problem, let's just blame an outside entity, i.e. Europe, North America. Let's just blame the West, blame the wealthy countries. That's the easy thing to do. It's much easier doing that than actually taking responsibility. And so much of the problems in Africa that I see comes from religion, which has its origins in the Middle East, by the way, but also from tribalism. And I know it's politically incorrect to say that, and incidentally that's another problem. You can't talk about these issues without being accused of racism, but what I'm talking about here is basic facts. Look at the violence during the 2008 Kenyan presidential election. That was entirely tribal based. Denying that is just ridiculous. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. France has blood on its hands for that genocide, but to say that there's no responsibility for the leaders involved is just absurd. So when Africa complains about African leaders being sent to the IOC, not the IOC, sorry, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, that to me is saying they're not going to take any responsibility. Now their argument is there's hypocrisy because there's examples of American and British leaders who also have blood on their hands. Okay, well that's fair enough, that charge of hypocrisy, but nevertheless it doesn't take away blame from the likes of Charles Taylor and Omar al-Bashir. And in the case of someone like Zimbabwe, if you're going to endorse a personality cult, then don't turn around and say, oh, things are terrible in this country, because Mugabe has huge responsibility for a lot of what's going on. Corruption in African countries is rife, and sooner or later Africans need to realise that some of the responsibility lies in their own governments, rather than always blaming outside forces.